The courtroom smelled like old wood and cheap floor wax. A girl stood at the front table, 12 years old.
Who the hell are
Gray
you?
hoodie, two
I
sizes
didn't
too
mean to
big.
intrude.
Sleeves
You picked
swallowed
the
past
wrong
her knuckles.
place.
The fabric so washed out it had
We have to
forgotten what
move.
color it used to be.
Now.
Her jeans
Where?
were
They'll
patched
find
at
us.
both
Trust
knees
me,
with
just follow.
mismatched squares of denim, and her sneakers were held together with silver duct tape wrapped tight around the toes where the rubber had split from the canvas. Her name was Ren Morrow. She stood perfectly still while the courtroom breathed around her. Behind her, wooden benches creaked under the weight of large men in black leather vests. Tattooed hands rested on tattooed knees, scarred knuckles, silver rings. The faint smell of motor oil and road dust drifting forward through the gallery like a quiet announcement that these men had come from somewhere the court had never been. On the other side of the aisle sat a man with a crooked tie and a flushed face and a court-appointed lawyer who kept whispering things the man didn't want to hear. The judge, a silver-haired woman in her 60s, who had seen more broken children pass through this room than she cared to remember, leaned forward and spoke gently. "Ren, where do you want to live?" The girl turned around. Her eyes moved across the rows of bikers, one face at a time, like she was counting them, like she was making sure they were real. Then she raised one small hand and pointed. But that moment was still 6 weeks away. And to understand what it meant, you have to go back to the afternoon. A bruised 12-year-old girl pushed open a door that most grown men in Braxton Falls would cross the street to avoid. The late afternoon sun was dying behind the rolling hills west of town, throwing long amber shadows across the cracked parking lot of the Stone Devils Motorcycle Club. The building sat at the far end of Gravel Mill Road, like something the town had tried to forget. Cinder block walls painted flat black sometime in the last century. A row of Harleys and Indians lined up out front like chrome and steel soldiers standing at attention. A hand-painted sign above the steel door, faded and chipped, read, "Stone Devils MCEST, 1979, and below that, in smaller letters someone had added with a spray can years ago, "Keep walking." Inside the clubhouse was alive in its own rough way. The low rumble of conversation filled the main room like a diesel engine idling. Beer bottles clinked against the scarred oak bar top. Pool balls cracked and scattered across faded green felt. An old Wurlitzer jukebox in the corner thumped out Creedence Clearwater Revival, the bass rattling a row of framed photos on the wall beside it. Photos of rides, of brothers, of men no longer here. The air was thick. Motor oil and worn leather and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the wood-paneled walls over decades until it became part of the architecture. The faint bitterness of strong black coffee brewing in the kitchen cut through it all like a blade through fog. More than a dozen men filled the space. Big men, rough men, men with scarred knuckles and faded tattoos that told stories of roads traveled and battles fought and years spent learning that the world doesn't hand you anything worth keeping. Their vests bore patches earned through loyalty and time stitched over hearts that most people in Braxton Falls assumed didn't beat at all. They were mechanics, veterans, ex-cons, fathers who'd lost custody, loners who'd found the only family that never asked them to be something they weren't. Men the town whispered about at church suppers and PTA meetings but never truly knew. Every head turned when the front door opened. The steel hinges groaned. Daylight cut a bright rectangle into the dim room. The jukebox seemed to lower its voice. Conversations died mid-sentence. A pool cue froze in mid-stroke, the 8-ball left trembling at the lip of the corner pocket. Standing in the doorway was a girl, small, thin, drowning in a faded gray hoodie that hung off her narrow shoulders like a flag with no wind. Her jeans were patched at both knees, and her sneakers, barely holding together with duct tape around the toes, made no sound on the concrete threshold. Her dark brown hair fell in messy tangles over eyes that looked far older than 12. And across her left cheek, spreading up around her eye socket, in a brutal bloom of purple and yellow, was a bruise that no one in that room could miss. A few of the bikers exchanged glances. Someone near the bar shifted on his stool. One man chuckled low and uncertain, the way people laugh when they don't know what else to do. "Wrong address, kid," a voice called from the back of the room. The voice belonged to a heavy-set man leaning against the far wall with a beer in his hand and a smirk on his face that faded quickly when the girl didn't react. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn and run. She stepped fully inside the clubhouse and let the heavy steel door swing shut behind her with a thud that echoed through the room like the closing of a book. Her hands stayed deep in the front pocket of her hoodie. Her shoulders were slightly hunched against the cold she'd brought in from outside, but her chin stayed level. She looked the room full of hardened bikers straight in the eye, and she said 5 words that left everyone in that clubhouse completely silent. "I'm looking for work." Her voice was quiet, but it was clear. It cut through the stillness like a clean blade. No tremor, no begging, just a girl stating a fact to a room full of men twice her height and 4 times her weight as calmly as if she were ordering a sandwich at a diner counter. After school, she continued, "I can sweep floors, wash bikes, clean tools, organize the shop. Whatever you need, I'm good on at it. I won't cause trouble." The laughter came then, louder this time, breaking the tension the way thunder breaks after a long silence. A giant of a man with a red beard that hung down to his chest and arms as thick as bridge cables slapped the bar top with an open palm that sounded like a gunshot. His name was Crank. "Hear that boy's kid wants to earn her patch already." A few others joined in, shaking their heads, grinning, but the grins were uneven, lopsided the way smiles look when they're trying to cover something that doesn't feel funny at all, because every man in that room had seen the bruise, and not one of them believed it came from falling off anything. In the far corner of the clubhouse, away from the bar and the pool table and the noise, there was a booth with cracked vinyl seats and a table stained by 1,000 coffee cups. The overhead light above it had burned out months ago, and nobody had bothered to replace it, which made the corner darker than the rest of the room, which was exactly why the man sitting there preferred it. His name was Dane Coulter, 45 years old, road captain of the Stone Devils, former United States Marine, 2 tours in Iraq, Fallujah, and Ramadi, the kind of places that taught you things about human beings that you spent the rest of your life trying to unlearn. His head was shaved clean. A jagged scar ran from just below his right ear down to his collarbone, a souvenir from a dusty road outside Ramadi, where a piece of shrapnel had come close enough to end his story and decided to leave a bookmark instead. His hands were large and rough and steady. They had pulled brothers from burning wreckage. They had held dying friends in the dark. They had learned to do things in silence that most men couldn't do with all the noise in the world. Dane didn't laugh when the girl spoke. He sat perfectly still, coffee going cold in front of him, and he watched her the way he had once watched doorways and rooftops and the faces of strangers in foreign markets. Reading, assessing, measuring the distance between what was being said and what was true. He saw her eyes first, dark brown, almost black in the dim light, and far too old for the face that held them. They moved constantly, cataloging exits and obstacles and the positions of every man in the room without appearing to look at any of them directly. Dane recognized that scan. He'd done it himself for years. It was the scan of someone who had learned that danger could come from anywhere at any time, and that the only defense was to never stop watching. Then he saw her hands, buried in the hoodie pocket, but the fabric was thin enough to show the outline of fists, clenched tight, not from cold. Then he saw the bruise. Not a single impact mark. A spread. The kind of bruise that comes from an open hand swung hard across a small face, fingers wrapping around the eye socket, the heel of the palm catching the cheekbone. Dane had seen bruises like that on the faces of women in Iraqi villages, on the faces of men in military brigs, on his own face once a long time ago, in a house on a dirt road in Kentucky where he'd grown up learning the same lesson this girl had clearly learned. That some doors you walk through knowing exactly what waiting on the other side. He saw something else too, something that stopped him cold. Determination, wrapped in quiet shame, the kind of strength that only comes from surviving things that no child should ever have to survive. She wasn't here because she was lost. She was here because she had decided to be here. There was a difference, and Dane Coulter knew it the way he knew the sound of his own heartbeat. He stood slowly. His heavy boots thudded on the stained concrete floor. 1 step, 2. The room noticed. When Dane moved, people paid attention. Not because he was the biggest man in the club, though he was close, but because he carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need volume. The laughter died down. The pool game paused again. Even Crank lowered his beer and watched. Dane stopped 6 feet from the girl, close enough to talk, far enough not to crowd. "What's your name, Kid Ren?" "Ren Morrow." Her voice didn't waver. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds, then dropped. Not from weakness, from calculation. She was deciding how much to give. You live around here, Ren Morrow. A small nod. Maple Street, blue house, sagging porch, chain link fence. Dane knew that house. Everyone in Braxton Falls knew that house, even if they pretended they didn't. A rental property on the rough end of Maple Street, paint peeling off the clapboard siding and long curls like dead skin yard overgrown with crabgrass and dandelions, curtains always half drawn, as if the house itself was trying not to be seen. It was a foster placement, run by a man named Russell Phelps. Big, loud, the kind of man who kept to himself and collected state checks and always had an answer ready when someone asked about the kids who came and went through his front door. Kids came. Bruises were explained as rough play. And eventually the kids went somewhere else and new ones arrived and nobody ever pushed too hard because pushing too hard meant paperwork and meetings and the uncomfortable possibility of discovering something that couldn't be ignored. Dane had driven past that house 100 times. He had never stopped. Until now, he hadn't had a reason. How old are you? 12. 13 in February. He took one step closer. Ren's shoulders tensed. A micro movement barely visible, but Dane caught it the way a man catches the glint of a tripwire in tall grass. She tensed, but she didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She held her ground, and that told Dane everything he needed to know. A kid who flinches has been hit and expects to be hit again. A kid who doesn't flinch has been hit so many times that she's stopped expecting anything different. She's moved past fear into something harder, something colder. Something that looks like courage but is really just the scar tissue of a childhood that ran out of softness a long time ago. That's a hell of a bruise you've got. The girl's jaw tightened. The muscles in her thin neck stood out like cables. Her eyes went flat. Fell off my skateboard. Smooth. Practiced. The words came out with the mechanical ease of a line rehearsed 100 times in bathroom mirrors and school hallways, in the back seats of caseworker sedans. You ride that skate or to school sometimes. Ren said nothing. Where exactly did you fall? Sidewalk, driveway, parking lot. Her eyes flicking down for just a second, calculating, weighing truth against consequence, measuring the cost of honesty against the price of another lie. Dane could almost see the math happening behind those old eyes. Does it matter? Yeah, Dane said. His voice dropped low and steady, the way a man's voice drops when he's not asking anymore but telling. It matters a lot. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight enough to hum. The other bikers had gone still throughout the room. Some stared at their drinks, some studied their phones. But every ear was tuned to the conversation at the front of the clubhouse, and every man in that room understood with the particular clarity that comes from having lived hard lives in hard places that something important was happening. Dane made his decision. Tell you what he said, keeping his voice casual as if the last 60 seconds hadn't happened. I got to check the shop out back, see what kind of work we actually have. You wait here, don't touch anything. Just sit. He pointed to a couch near the front window. An old thing, cracked brown leather stuffing, leaking out of one arm, like tired memories, springs visible through the worn cushions. It had been in the clubhouse since before most of the current members had joined, and it had held the weight of men celebrating, and men grieving, and men simply sitting in silence because they had nowhere else to go. Ren walked to the couch. She sat straight-backed, hands still buried in the hoodie pocket, feet flat on the floor, eyes fixed on the scuffed concrete beneath her shoes. She didn't lean back. She didn't relax. She sat the way a person sits in a waiting room when they know the news is probably bad, but they've come too far to leave. Dane didn't go to the shop. He pushed through the back door of the clubhouse into the cold evening air, pulled his phone from the inside pocket of his vest, and dialed a number he hadn't used in over 3 years. An old Marine buddy from his unit. A man who had shared a foxhole with him outside Fallujah and now worked for the county's Department of Social Services. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered. Dane identified himself, asked to be transferred, waited. Then the familiar voice came on the line, older, now rougher but unmistakable. Dane spoke for 9 minutes. He described the girl, the bruise, the address, the name Russell Phelps. He kept his voice level and factual, the way he'd been trained to deliver field reports, because emotion wastes time, and time was something he wasn't sure this girl had much of. When he hung up, he stood in the cold for another full minute, staring at the gravel, breathing fog into the darkness. Then he went back inside. 2 hours passed. Slow hours. The kind of hours that move like cold oil. Men came and went. The jukebox cycled through its catalog and started over. Someone ordered wings from the kitchen. The smell of hot sauce and fried chicken drifted through the clubhouse and mixed with the permanent cologne of oil and leather in old smoke. Wren didn't move. She sat on that broken couch like a statue carved from something harder than stone. Hands in her pocket, back straight, eyes down. She didn't ask for the bathroom. She didn't ask for water. She didn't shift or fidget or do any of the things that 12-year-old kids normally do when they're sitting still in an unfamiliar place surrounded by strangers. After about an hour, a woman emerged from the kitchen. Her name was Jolene Hargrove. 53 years old, built solid with kind eyes and calloused hands and gray-streaked auburn hair, pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She had been cooking for the Stone Devils on weekends for 15 years, and in that time she had become the club's unofficial den mother. The person who remembered birthdays and made sure the fridge was stocked and quietly handled the human details that tough men sometimes forgot needed handling. Jolene carried a plate, a thick ham and cheese sandwich on sourdough cut diagonal the way a mother cuts a sandwich, a handful of barbecue chips, a cold Coca-Cola in a glass bottle still sweating from the fridge. She set the plate silently on the armrest beside Wren. Then she gave the girl's shoulder the gentlest squeeze, a touch so light it was barely there, but Wren's whole body reacted to it. A tiny flinch, then a stillness even deeper than before, as if the unexpected kindness had cracked something open and she was trying to seal it shut before anything could escape. Jolene walked away without a word. Wren stared at the food. She stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. The sandwich sat there, golden and warm cheese melting slightly at the edges, and the girl looked at it the way a stray dog looks at a hand that might be offering food or might be about to swing. Like she was waiting for the catch, waiting for someone to laugh and take it away, waiting for the price. Finally she ate, small bites, careful, deliberate, almost ritualistic. She tore the sandwich into pieces first, then ate each piece slowly, chewing, thoroughly savoring every mouthful, as if she had learned long ago that food was never guaranteed and waste was a sin that hunger had taught her she could not afford. She drank the Coke in small sips, holding the bottle with both hands, and when she was finished, she placed the empty bottle and the clean plate back on the armrest with a precision that suggested she wanted to leave no evidence of herself behind. When Dane came back through the front door, Wren was exactly where he'd left her, hadn't moved an inch. The plate was clean. The bottle was empty, and her hands were back in the hoodie pocket as if they'd never left. Dane pulled a wooden chair from one of the card tables, set it in front of the couch, and sat down, so they were at eye level. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, big hands hanging loose between them, and he looked at Wren, the way you look at someone when you want them to know you're not going anywhere. All right, Wren, we've got work, sweeping the garage, organizing tools, washing bikes, basic stuff, $10 an hour, 3 days a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. 2 hours after school, you show up on time, you work hard, you don't steal, and you never lie to us. He paused. Can you handle that? For the first time since she had walked through that heavy steel door, something shifted in Wren Morrow's carefully guarded expression. It was small, barely visible, the kind of change you'd miss if you blinked. Her eyes widened just a fraction, and in them, deep behind the walls she'd built, and the mask she'd learned to wear, and the bruise that colored half her face, there appeared something fragile and ancient and long buried. Hope. Not the loud kind, not the kind that throws its arms open and shouts at the sky. The quiet kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that lives in a place so deep inside a person that it survives everything the world throws at it, even when the person carrying it doesn't believe it's still there. Yes, sir. 2 words, steady, clear, and underneath them, invisible but unmistakable, the sound of a door opening, somewhere inside a girl who had learned to keep every door locked. Good. Tuesday, 4 o'clock. Don't be late. Wren stood. She nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement like a soldier acknowledging an order. Then she walked to the door, pulled it open, and stepped into the evening. Dane called after her. Wren. She stopped, turned. Half her face was in shadow. half in the warm light spilling from the clubhouse. The bruise looked darker now. That bruise didn't come from any skateboard. It wasn't a question. And Wren didn't treat it like one. Her face went carefully, perfectly blank. The mask slid back into place like a visor snapping down. She looked at him for one full second, and in that second, Dane saw something that made his chest tight. Not fear, not anger, just a profound and terrible acceptance. The acceptance of a 12-year-old who knew exactly what was waiting for her at the end of Maple Street and who was going to walk there anyway because she had learned that the world didn't offer alternatives to kids like her. Tuesday, Dane said, 4 o'clock. The door closed softly behind her. A soft click, not a slam. Even in leaving, Wren Morrow made as little noise as possible. The clubhouse let out a collective breath. Crank spoke first, leaning heavy against the bar, his massive frame suddenly looking less like a wall and more like something that had been hit. "You serious, Dane?" Giving work to a kid, Dane stood at the window. Through the dusty glass, he watched the small figure in the oversized gray hoodie moving down the sidewalk, getting smaller against the fading light shoulders, hunched against a wind that probably wasn't all weather. That, he said quietly, was a kid throwing out a lifeline in the only way she knew how. He turned from the window. His eyes were hard. "And we're going to grab it." The room was silent. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Somewhere in the back, Jolene stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and tears running quietly down her face, and she didn't wipe them away because some tears don't need hiding. Dane was about to turn away from the window when something caught his eye. A small square of paper folded tight sitting on the couch cushion where Wren had been. It must have slipped from her hoodie pocket when she stood. He walked over and picked it up, unfolded it. It was a photocopy. Faded, creased, handled so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. A birth certificate. State of Ohio, issued 12 years ago. The child's name was typed in official black ink, Wren Elise Morrow, date of birth, January 14th. And in the field marked, mother's name, Nora Christine Morrow. Father's name was blank. Dane turned the paper over. On the binding pencil in the careful but unsteady hand of a child who had pressed too hard because the words mattered too much were 2 words. Find her. Dane read those 2 words 3 times. Then he folded the paper along its original creases and slipped it into the inner pocket of his vest, next to his heart, where he kept the things that mattered. He didn't go home that night. He sat at the corner booth with his laptop open and his phone charging on the table and a pot of black coffee that Jolene kept refilling without being asked. He searched public records, foster placement databases, county court filings. He ran the name Nora Morrow through every free search engine he could find and a few paid ones he'd kept access to from the old days. And at 11:47 that night, in the blue glow of his screen, Dane Coulter found something that changed everything. Nora Christine Morrow, born in Braxton Falls, 21 years old at the time of her disappearance 12 years ago. Single mother, employed as a waitress at a diner on Route 9, a diner that Dane drove past every single day, a diner owned and operated by a woman named Jolene Hargrove. Nora had worked less than 300 yards from the clubhouse door her daughter had just walked through. But that wasn't what stopped Dane's breath. He pulled up the old missing persons report, filed by Jolene Hargrove herself 12 years ago, after Nora failed to show up for 3 consecutive shifts and didn't answer her phone. The police report was thin, 2 pages. Conclusion: probable voluntary departure. Case closed after 7 days. The responding officer noted that a man named Russell Phelps, described as a family friend, had reported that Nora left the infant at a gas station on Route 9 and never returned. Phelps had taken the baby to the county office and filed for emergency foster placement. He was granted temporary custody within 48 hours. Dane stared at that name. Russell Phelps, family friend. Then he searched Russell Phelps in the county residential records. And there it was. Russell Phelps had not lived in Braxton Falls when Nora Morrow was working at Jolene's diner. He had moved to Braxton Falls in the same month Nora disappeared. Before that, he was registered at an address in Cutter County, 60 miles south. There was no overlap, no shared history, no connection between Russell Phelps and Nora Morrow that existed before the day she vanished. He was not a family friend. He had never been a family friend. The man who'd been raising Wren Morrow for 12 years, collecting state checks and handing out bruises, was a complete stranger who had appeared from nowhere the same week her mother disappeared from the face of the earth. Dane closed the laptop. He sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the hum of the empty clubhouse, feeling the folded birth certificate against his chest. Ren Morrow hadn't chosen the Stone Devils at random. She had found this place because she had been looking, searching, following whatever thin trail a 12-year-old girl could follow with a photocopied birth certificate and 2 words written in pencil. Find her. She had walked through that door carrying more than a bruise and a need for work. She had walked in carrying a mission. And she had chosen the one place in Braxton Falls that sat 300 yards from the last place her mother had been seen alive. That girl was not a victim. She was a detective. And she didn't even know yet that the men she'd just asked for a job were about to become her army. Tuesday arrived under a steel gray sky that pressed down on Braxton Falls like a hand flattening dough. The temperature had dropped overnight and a raw wind pushed dead leaves across the cracked parking lot of the Stone Devils clubhouse in scraping circles. Ren was waiting outside at 3:50, 10 minutes early, same hoodie, same patched jeans, shifting her weight from foot to foot, arms crossed tight over her chest, looking ready to bolt at any second like a bird perched on a wire that vibrates with every passing truck. Dane opened the door before she could knock. Early. That's a good start. Come on in. He led her through the main room, quieter now than it had been Saturday, past the bar and the pool table, and the jukebox standing silent in its corner, and out through a heavy fire door into the garage. The garage was a different world. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, throwing cold white light across a concrete floor, oil-stained in patterns that looked like ancient maps. 5 motorcycles sat in a row along the far wall, chrome and black paint gleaming under the lights like museum pieces. Workbenches lined both sides of the room, their surfaces covered in organized tools and disassembled parts and rags stained with the honest filth of real work. Pegboards on the walls held wrenches and sockets and screwdrivers in perfect order, each tool outlined in marker, so you knew where it belonged when you were done. The air smelled like gasoline, rubber, and possibility. A wiry man in his late 50s stood at the center bench, hands deep in the exposed engine of a 1998 Harley-Davidson Road King, moving with the deliberate precision of a surgeon. His salt and pepper hair was tied back in a short ponytail, and permanent grease was etched into the whorls of his fingertips like tattoos given by the trade itself. His name was Stitch. Former Army medic, Gulf War, where he'd learned to fix men and machines in equal measure under conditions that didn't allow for hesitation. He could diagnose an engine problem from 20 feet away by sound alone, the way some people can hear a wrong note in a symphony. Kids on cleanup and organization duty, Dane told him. Show her what needs doing. Stitch gave Ren a long, measuring look, the kind of look that takes inventory without asking a single question. His eyes moved from the bruise on her face to the tape on her shoes, to the way she stood, slightly turned left side forward, chin down, the unconscious stance of someone accustomed to protecting their midsection. He said nothing about any of it. He reached under the bench, pulled out a push broom with a wooden handle worn smooth by 100 hands, and held it out. Start in the corners, work toward the center. Don't miss under the benches. Ren took the broom, and she attacked the job like it was the most important thing she had ever been asked to do. She swept every corner, every crack where the concrete had settled unevenly, every hidden crevice beneath workbenches and tool cabinets where sawdust and metal shavings and small forgotten bolts had accumulated into tiny archaeological layers of work done by men who were too focused on the big things to notice the small ones. She didn't miss a speck of dust. She didn't miss a single drop bolt. Stitch watched from his bench without appearing to watch. He'd spent years in field hospitals reading the vital signs of men who couldn't speak, and he brought that same quiet diagnostic attention to everything he did. He noticed the focus, the precision, the pride she took in doing the job right. She wasn't sweeping a floor. She was proving something to someone who wasn't in the room. After an hour, Stitch called her over to a workbench. He pulled out a large plastic bin filled with mixed hardware. Bolts, washers, nuts, cotter pins, small engine parts all jumbled together like a metal junk drawer. You know anything about engines? No, sir. One of Ren's eyes changed. It was like someone had flipped a switch inside a dark room. Light came on behind those old, careful eyes, and for a second, just a second, she looked exactly like what she was. A 12-year-old kid being offered the chance to learn something that mattered. Yes, sort these, Stitch said, tapping the bin. Group by size and type. Think you can handle it? Wren nodded and sat down on the concrete floor with the bin between her knees. She began sorting with her fingers, separating washers from bolts, grouping nuts by thread count, creating neat, precise rows on the floor beside her, with the careful attention of someone building something important out of small pieces. 20 minutes later, Stitch walked over and stopped short. The parts were organized better than he usually managed himself. Sorted not just by type and size, but by where the newer hardware, separated from the older pieces, the stripped bolts pulled aside into their own category. The rows were perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned. The work of hands that craved order because the rest of their world had none. "You've got steady hands," Stitch said. His voice was different now, softer, stripped of its professional distance, and a good eye. Wren looked up. For just a second, the guard dropped. The mask lifted. And underneath it was a face that looked so young and so tired and so hungry for a kind word that Stitch had to turn away to keep his composure. "My mom used to let me help in the garage," Wren said quietly. Before, the word hung in the air like smoke from a blown-out candle. Before. One word carrying the entire weight of a life divided in half. The time when things were one way and the time after when they were another. For what Stitch didn't ask, he had spent enough years around wounded people to know that some stories only come out when they're ready, and pushing them before their time does more damage than the silence. "Well," he said, "if you keep showing up like this, I'll teach you the basics. How an engine breathes, how to take one apart and put it back together. Might come in handy someday." "Really?" The word cracked in the middle, just slightly, a hairline fracture in the armor of a girl who had taught herself to expect nothing so that nothing could disappoint her. "Really?" The shift ended at 6. Wren put the broom back in its exact place, aligned the sorted hardware bins on the shelf with their labels facing forward, and wiped down the section of bench she'd been working at with a rag until the surface was cleaner than it had been when she started. Then she stood by the garage door with her hands in her hoodie pocket, waiting. Roach appeared from the main room. Hank DeLuca, vice president of the Stone Devils. A massive man with a snow-white beard and eyes too gentle for the face that held them. He was 61 years old, built like a retired offensive lineman, with hands the size of dinner plates and a voice that came from somewhere deep in his chest like distant thunder. Everyone called him Roach because 30 years ago he'd survived a motorcycle crash that should have killed him, walked away from the wreckage with a broken collarbone, and road rashed down his entire left side and ridden a borrowed bike home the same night. The name was a compliment. You couldn't kill the man, but there were things that had come close. He'd lost his wife to cancer at 44. 5 years later, his teenage daughter had spiraled into the foster system during a custody battle with his in-laws that he'd lost because a judge looked at his leather vest and his police record and decided that a motorcycle club was no place for a child. He hadn't seen her in 7 years. The system had swallowed her whole, and by the time he had the legal standing to look for her, she had aged out and disappeared. He never talked about it, but anyone who knew him could see it in the way his enormous hands became impossibly gentle around anything small or fragile or in need of protection. "I'll walk you part way," he told Wren. Getting dark. They walked in comfortable silence for 3 blocks. The streets of Braxton Falls were quiet at this hour. The sidewalks empty, the storefronts closed, the only sound the distant bark of a bomb and the crunch of their footsteps on cracked concrete. "You like the work?" Roach asked. "Yeah, a lot. Stitch is good people," Roach said. Wren nodded but didn't elaborate. She walked with her head slightly down, watching the ground ahead of her feet with the vigilance of someone who had learned that looking down was safer than looking up. They turned onto Maple Street. Wren's steps slowed. The blue house came into view at the end of the block. Peeling paint, overgrown yard, chain-link fence with a broken gate that hung open at an angle, curtains half drawn, a porch light that was burned out or turned off, and behind one of those curtained windows the shadow of a large man moving. Roach felt it, the way her whole body changed, the way her shoulders drew inward and her stride shortened, and her breathing went shallow and quick, like a small animal entering a field where it knows a predator is watching. She didn't speed up. She didn't slow down. She just shrank, as if she could make herself small enough to pass through the front door without being noticed. He stopped one house away. From inside his vest, he pulled out a small white card. Plain, no decoration, just the phone number of the clubhouse printed in black ink. "If anything ever feels wrong," he said, "if you ever need someone, call this number. Day or night, someone will answer." Wren took the card. She held it in her thin fingers and looked at it the way someone looks at a life preserver thrown from a passing ship. Like she wanted to believe it would float, but had been in the water too long to trust anything. "Why are you doing this?" Roach's throat tightened. He thought of his daughter, of all the calls he'd never gotten, of the nights he'd sat in the dark wondering if she was safe and knowing in his bones that she probably wasn't, and that the system that had taken her from him didn't give a damn. "Because you walked in and asked for work instead of a handout. That takes real courage, kid, and courage deserves backup." Wren stared at the card for another long moment. Then she tucked it deep into the pocket of her jeans. Not the hoodie, the jeans, where it wouldn't fall out, where it would be close to her body safe. "Thank you." 2 words, almost inaudible. But Roach heard them the way a father hears a child's voice in a crowded room. Wren turned and walked to the blue house. Up the cracked concrete path, up the sagging porch steps. She opened the front door without knocking, stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. The porch light stayed off. Roach stood on the sidewalk for a full 2 minutes, staring at that dark house, listening for sounds that didn't come, feeling a weight in his chest that no amount of deep breathing could shift. Then he pulled out his phone and called Dane. "It's bad, brother." His voice was low, rough, the voice of a man fighting to keep his composure. "That house feels wrong. The kid's scared to walk through her own door." There was a pause on the other end. Then Dane's voice, cold and level, and edged with something that sounded like iron. "I know. I've already started making calls. We document everything. Bruises, dates, times. We build a case. And if the system moves too slow," Dane didn't answer. He didn't need to, but that night in the quiet of the clubhouse under the blue glow of his laptop screen, Dane wasn't just building a case about bruises on a 12-year-old girl. He was unraveling something much older, much darker. A thread that led from a photocopied birth certificate to a missing waitress, to a man who had appeared in Braxton Falls from nowhere, carrying an infant that wasn't his, telling a story that nobody had ever bothered to check. Nora Morrow hadn't run away. Dane was sure of it now. A mother who carried her baby to the pediatrician in the morning didn't abandon that baby at a gas station in the afternoon. A woman who wrote "My heart" on the back of her daughter's photograph didn't walk away from that heart without a fight. And a man who wasn't a family friend didn't become one overnight unless he needed a story, and the real story was something that couldn't survive the light. Dane saved the files, closed the laptop, sat in the dark. Somewhere on Maple Street, in a blue house with a sagging porch and a broken gate, a 12-year-old girl was lying in a bed that wasn't hers, in a room that wasn't home, holding a phone number card against her chest like a talisman. And somewhere in the same house, a man named Russell Phelps was pouring his 4th drink of the night, unaware that the girl he'd been hurting for years had just done the bravest thing he could imagine. She had walked through a door and asked strangers for help. Not in those words. She was too proud for that, too hardened, too smart. She had asked for work. She had asked for a chance, but Dane understood the translation because he had once been a kid who spoke the same language. "Help me, but let me earn it, because earning it is the only way I know how to keep it." Tuesday was over. Thursday was coming, and after Thursday would come the days and weeks that would change everything, not just for Wren Morrow, but for every man in the Stone Devils who had forgotten that the hardest thing in the world isn't riding through a storm. It's stopping for someone standing in one. 3 weeks changed the geometry of the Stone Devils garage. Where there had been dust in the corners, there was none. Where tools had leaned against walls in careless angles, they now hung in their marked places on the pegboard. Every wrench and socket and screwdriver returned to its outlined shadow before Wren left each shift. The concrete floor, once mapped with oil stains and boot prints and the accumulated grime of years, now showed its original pale gray in patches that grew wider each week, like clearings opening in a dark forest. Wren showed up every scheduled day without fail. Often early, always silent when she arrived, slipping through the garage door like a draft of cold air, hoodie zipped to her chin, moving soundlessly across the concrete. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. Stitch would look up from whatever engine he was buried in, give her a nod, and she would pick up where she'd left off, as if the hours between shifts hadn't happened at all. Stitch taught her the way he'd been taught, not with lectures, not with manuals, With hands and silence and the slow accumulation of trust between a teacher and a student who both understood that the best lessons happen when nobody's trying to teach. He showed her how spark plugs worked, how the gap between the electrodes had to be exact, not close, not almost exact, because an engine doesn't forgive approximation. He taught her how to read a torque wrench, how the click meant stop and anything past the click meant damage, and how the difference between tight enough and too tight was the difference between a machine that ran for 100,000 miles and one that shook itself apart on the highway. He explained how a Harley engine breathed, how air came in through the intake mixed with fuel in a precise ratio, compressed, ignited, and exhaled through the pipes in that deep rolling thunder that made people turn their heads on the street. Every part trusts the others to do its job, Stitch told her, hands deep in the V-twin of a 2003 Road King. The piston trusts the cylinder wall. The valve trusts the spring. The spark plug trusts the timing chain. One part fails, the whole thing fails. But when every part does its job, you get something that sounds like God clearing his throat. Wren listened to every word with an intensity that bordered on devotion. Her hands, once hesitant and uncertain around the heavy tools, grew steadier with each session. Calluses formed on her palms and fingers, small hard patches of new skin that told the story of work being done by hands that had previously known only the work of surviving. She learned to identify a 3/8 socket by weight alone. She could hand-stitch the right wrench before he asked for it, reading the job the way a surgical nurse reads an operation, anticipating the next move. A small, careful smile sometimes appeared when Stitch praised a job well done. Not a big smile, not the kind that takes over a face. A small one, guarded, like a match struck in a drafty room, flickering in the knowledge that it could be blown out at any second. For 2 hours at a time, 3 days a week, Wren Morrow was safe. She was seen. She was spoken to like a person who mattered. She was learning that hard work could earn respect instead of pain, that an adult's voice could carry instruction without threat, that the space between two people could be filled with quiet competence instead of fear. But outside those hours, the world was what it had always been. The bruises kept coming. A split lip on Thursday, the lower left side swollen and scabbed, the kind of split that comes from a backhand, not a fall, because falls don't land with that specific precision on the soft tissue where lip meets chin. Wren said she'd caught an elbow during a pickup basketball game at school. She said it while looking at a point 6 inches to the left of Stitch's face. The next Tuesday, a dark ring around her right wrist that looked exactly like fingerprints. 4 bruises on top, 1 on the bottom, spaced perfectly to match a large hand that had grabbed and twisted. She said she'd caught her wrist in a closing door. She said it while organizing a bin of carriage bolts with a focus so intense it was clearly a wall built to keep questions on the other side. The Tuesday after that, she moved stiffly through the whole shift. Reaching for tools on the upper pegboard made her wince and catch her breath, and she spent most of the 2 hours working at bench height or below, avoiding anything that required her to raise her arms above her shoulders. She said she'd pulled a muscle in gym class. She always had an explanation. The explanations were always delivered in the same flat, rehearsed tone, like lines read from a script she'd been memorizing her entire life. And her eyes never met theirs when she said them. Not once. She'd look at the floor, or at a tool in her hands, or at a spot on the wall behind whoever was asking, and she'd deliver her line and wait for the moment to pass the way a person waits for a wave to break over them, holding their breath, knowing it will end, knowing another one is coming. The club watched. They watched and they documented quietly, carefully, with the disciplined patience of men who understood that the difference between justice and vengeance was evidence. Dane took photographs with his phone when Wren wasn't looking. Quick shots from across the garage capturing the bruise on the wrist, the swelling on the lip, the way she favored her right side when she thought nobody was paying attention. He dated each photo, noted the time, filed them in a locked folder on his phone. Roach carried a small notebook in the inside pocket of his leather vest. Black cover unlined pages, the kind of notebook a man buys at a gas station for $2 and uses to record the things that matter most. In it, he wrote dates and observations in his careful, blocky handwriting. Tuesday, October 8th. Bruise on left wrist, consistent with grabbing. Kid favoring her left arm. Said she caught it in a door. Thursday, October 10th. Split lip lower left, consistent with open hand strike. Kid said basketball. No basketball season until November. He wrote these notes the way a man builds a case, one brick at a time. Jolene handled her part without being asked. Each shift, she packed a backpack with food for Ren to take home. Not a paper bag, not a plastic sack, but a proper backpack, dark blue, nondescript, the kind a kid could carry without it looking like charity. Inside, she tucked sandwiches wrapped in foil apples, granola bars, protein bars, a juice box, and once a slice of homemade blueberry pea wrapped in wax paper with a small note that said, "You earned this." Ren never refused the backpack, but she never said thank you out loud either. She just took it with a small nod and tucked it against her body the way a soldier carries ammunition, close and careful, because what's inside keeps you alive. The explosion came on a Thursday, 5:17 in the evening. Ren was at the workbench beside Stitch, carefully disassembling a carburetor that Stitch had pulled from a junked Sportster specifically for teaching purposes. Her hands were steady. Her focus was absolute. For the first time that week, the tension in her shoulders had eased just enough to let her breathe naturally, and Stitch had noticed, and the noticing had made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something like hope. The garage door banged open so hard the sheet metal panels rattled in their frames, and a socket wrench vibrated off the edge of a bench and rang against the concrete floor like a bell. "Where's the damn kid?" Russell Phelps filled the doorway the way a boulder fills a creek bed. 6'3", heavy guts straining the buttons of a stained flannel work shirt, face the color of raw beef flushed from alcohol, and the particular kind of rage that lives just beneath the surface of men who have spent their entire lives being angry at things they can't name. His bloodshot eyes, small and buried in fleshy sockets, swept the garage until they locked onto Ren. She had gone completely still. Not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of a creature that has heard the footstep of its predator and knows that movement means death. Every muscle in her thin body locked. The carburetor float she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and clinked against the bench. Her breathing stopped. Stitch stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, just a calm lateral movement that placed his body between Russell and the girl. He still had a grease rag in his right hand, and he twisted it slowly between his fingers, a motion that looked casual but wasn't. "Can I help you? You can get out of my way." Russell's voice was a snarl, thick with bourbon and contempt. "That's my foster girl, and her shift, or whatever the hell you call it, is over. She's got chores at home." Ren's breathing came back, shallow, rapid, the breathing of a cornered animal. Dane appeared from the office doorway at the back of the garage. He didn't rush. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who has learned that calm is a weapon and panic is a gift you give to your enemies. His boots made no sound on the concrete. His face showed nothing. Behind him, Crank materialized from the main room. Then two more. They didn't stand in a line. They didn't cross their arms or crack their knuckles or do any of the theatrical things that men do in movies when they want to look threatening. They simply existed. Large, solid, unhurried presences filling the space behind Dane like a wall growing brick by brick. "Mr. Phelps," Dane's voice was even, conversational, the voice of a man discussing weather or breakfast plans. But underneath it ran a current so cold it could have frozen the pipes. "Ren's shift ends at 6. It's 5:20. She'll be home when she's done." Russell's face darkened. The flush crept from his cheeks down to his thick neck, and a vein pulsed visibly at his temple, keeping time with a heart rate that was running too fast on too much bourbon. "I don't give a damn about your little schedule. I didn't sign up for her working here. She's got responsibilities." What kind of responsibilities? Dane took one step forward. Just one. But the step changed the geometry of the room the way a single chess move can change the geometry of a game. He was closer to Russell now, close enough for Russell to see the scar that ran from Dane's ear to his collarbone, close enough to smell the coffee on his breath and notice the absolute absence of fear in his eyes. "That's between me and her." Is it? Dane's tone shifted. Still quiet, still controlled, but the temperature in the garage dropped 10 degrees. "Because she keeps showing up here with new marks, split lips, finger bruises on her arms, and her caseworker hasn't checked in once in months. So I'm real curious, Mr. Phelps, what exactly these responsibilities are." The garage went dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like witnesses afraid to speak. The 5 motorcycles along the far wall gleamed in the harsh light, and their chrome reflected the scene in warped miniature, as if even they were watching. Russell's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw worked. But he wasn't stupid. Drunk, yes. Enraged, yes. But not stupid enough to miss the math. 5 large men stood between him and the girl. Dane's military bearing radiated a threat that no amount of drunken anger could match. And somewhere behind those men in the dim hallway that led to the main room, more boots were audible on concrete moving closer. "You don't know what you're talking about," Russell muttered. His voice had dropped. The snarl was gone, replaced by something smaller, something that sounded almost rehearsed. "Kids fall. They're clumsy. And if she'd just keep her mouth shut like her mother did." He stopped. The sentence hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Every man in the room heard it. Every man understood what had just happened. Russell's eyes widened slightly the way a man's eyes widen when he realizes he stepped on something that was meant to stay buried. Like her mother did, what Dane's voice was barely above a whisper now. The most dangerous volume a man can use because it forces everyone in the room to lean in. And leaning in means listening, and listening means remembering. Russell didn't answer. His mouth opened, then closed. The flush on his face had changed character. It was no longer the red of alcohol and anger. It was the red of a man standing too close to something that could burn him. He jabbed a thick finger toward Wren. "You home. 1 hour, don't make me come back." He turned and stormed out of the garage, slamming the steel door behind him so hard a wrench bounced off its pegboard hook and clattered to the floor. His boots crunched across the gravel parking lot. An engine started. Tires spun. Then silence. Wren stood at the workbench. Her hands trembled against the scarred wood surface. The carburetor parts she'd been sorting were scattered where the door's impact had shaken them loose. She stared at her own fingers as if they belonged to someone else. Stitch crouched beside her, slowly, the way you approach a bird with a broken wing. No sudden movements. No loud voice. "You're okay, kid. He's gone." "I should go." "Not yet," Dane said. He was already pulling out his phone. "Roach, get over here. Now." Wren looked up, and for the first time in the 3 weeks she had been coming to the garage, she spoke without being asked a question. Her voice was quiet, unsteady, but the words came out with the terrible clarity of something that had been locked inside a chest for years and had finally found the keyhole. "He said that before, about my mother keeping quiet. When he's drunk, he talks about her like she's still somewhere." Nobody moved. Dane crouched down so he was at her eye level. His face was carefully neutral, but his hand resting on the workbench beside hers gripped the wood so hard his knuckles went white. "What does he say, Wren?" She shook her head. Small, tight movements. Not refusal. Overwhelm. The shaking head of someone who has opened a door they're not sure they can walk through. "He says she should have listened. He says if she'd listened, things would have been different. He says it's her fault." Dane looked at Stitch. Stitch looked at the floor. In the silence, the fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent song, and outside the wind pushed against the garage walls as if it, too, was trying to get in. 11:40 that night. Jolene's Diner on Route 9. Warm light spilling from windows fogged with condensation. The smell of coffee strong enough to rebuild an engine and bacon grease that never fully left the air, not even at midnight. Dane sat in the back booth. Roach sat across from him, his massive frame squeezed into the vinyl seat, white beard freshly trimmed, but his eyes red-rimmed and raw. Between them on the table sat 2 cups of black coffee, a cell phone, and a worn leather notebook. Jolene locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and walked to the booth carrying a cardboard box that she set on the table with the careful reverence of someone handling remains. "I was cleaning out old files last year," she said. "Found this." She opened the box and pulled out a thin manila folder. The label on the tab was handwritten in blue ink that had faded to gray. Nora Morrow. Inside was a single-page employment record. Hired as a waitress 12 years ago. Age 21. Excellent worker. Reliable. Never missed a shift in 9 months. Emergency contact listed as none. Next of kin listed as none. Single mother with infant daughter. Then one day Jolene said, her voice steady, but her hands not. She just stopped showing up. No call, no notice. She never picked up her last paycheck. I kept it in the register for 3 months thinking she'd come back. She never did. Jolene reached into the folder and pulled out something else. A photograph. Polaroid, the kind with the white border. The colors had shifted with age, going slightly orange, the way old Polaroids do, but the image was clear enough. A young woman with dark brown hair and dark brown eyes holding an infant against her chest. The woman was smiling. Not a big smile, not a performer's smile, but the real kind, the kind that starts somewhere deep inside and barely makes it to the surface because the happiness is too private to share with the whole world. The infant was wrapped in a white blanket, sleeping, one tiny fist curled against the woman's collarbone. On the bag in faded ink, 2 lines, Ren, 4 months. My heart. Roach picked up the photo. His hands, those dinner plate hands that could crush a beer can without trying, held the Polaroid with the gentleness of a man holding a soap bubble. She was sweet, Jolene continued. Barely 21, always talking about her little girl. Said Ren was her whole world. That she was working doubles to save for an apartment with a yard. She had a plan. She had a future. She was building something. Jolene's eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. Not yet. I called the police when she didn't show up for 3 days. Filed a report. They sent an officer out. He came back and told me single moms sometimes just disappear. Case closed in a week. The bitterness in her voice could have etched glass. Dane pulled out his phone and opened the files he'd found the night Ren first came to the clubhouse. The residential records, the timeline. He laid the facts out the way Maddox would later lay them out in court, one piece at a time. Russell Phelps moved to Braxton Falls the same month Nora disappeared. Before that, he lived 60 miles south. No connection to Nora. No shared friends, no overlapping addresses, no record of them ever being in the same room. He told the county he was a family infant, that Nora had abandoned Ren at a gas station. He paused. But the hospital records filed with the original foster placement tell a different story. Nora took Ren to a pediatric appointment at Braxton Falls Community Clinic on the morning of June 14th. The appointment note says the baby was healthy, gaining weight, meeting milestones. The doctor specifically noted that the mother appeared bonded and invested in the child's care. He looked up. That was the morning of the day Russell Phelps says Nora abandoned her daughter at a gas station on Route 9. A mother who takes her baby to the doctor at 9 in the morning does not leave that baby with a stranger at 3 in the afternoon. The booth was silent. The coffee went cold. Outside Route 9 was empty and dark, and somewhere on it, 12 years ago, a young woman had vanished from the world, and no one with any power to do anything about it had cared enough to ask the right questions. Jolene spoke first. You think he did something to her? It wasn't a question, and Dane didn't treat it like one. I think a devoted mother doesn't disappear without a trace. And I think Russell Phelps knows exactly what happened that day. Dane called Detective Lena Maddox at the county's Department of Social Services the next morning. Maddox was not a woman who wasted time on pleasantries. She was 48 years old, former county prosecutor, now embedded in the Child Welfare Division, with a dual mandate to investigate both abuse and the systemic failures that allowed it to continue. She had a reputation for being relentless, methodical, and completely uninterested in the politics of protecting institutions at the expense of children. Dane gave her everything: the photographs, Roach's notebook, the employment records from Jolene, the residential history of Russell Phelps, the hospital records, the original missing persons report from 12 years ago. Maddox was quiet for a long time after he finished. The silence on the phone was not the silence of disinterest. It was the silence of a professional recalculating the dimensions of a problem that had just gotten much larger than expected. Then she spoke. One sentence that confirmed what Dane had suspected. He's moved counties 4 times in 12 years. Every time just before the local CPS office started looking too closely at his placements. It's a pattern, and this isn't the first child, she paused. I'll have a preliminary report filed by end of day. But Dane, I need to tell you something else. I ran a check on Russell Phelps's pending case actions this morning. He's already submitted paperwork to transfer his foster placement of Ren Morrow to a new county. The transfer is scheduled for processing next Monday. Dane's blood went cold. Next Monday. If we don't move before Friday, she's gone. New county, new caseworker, new address. Same pattern, same disappearing act he's been running for over a decade. Ren Morrow vanishes into the system, and Russell Phelps starts over somewhere else with a clean slate and a new check. How fast can you get a hearing? If I file an emergency petition today and the evidence holds, we could have an emergency custody hearing by Friday morning. Do it. Wren came to the garage on Tuesday afternoon, and Stitch knew something was wrong before she made it through the door. She moved the way a person moves when the simple act of walking has become a negotiation with pain. Each step was measured, considered as if she were crossing a frozen lake and testing the ice with every footfall. Her left arm hung slightly forward, guarding her midsection. When she reached for the push broom, a small sound escaped her lips, involuntary, the kind of sound that slips past clenched teeth when the body overrides the will. Stitch set down the valve spring he'd been inspecting and walked over to her. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if she was okay. He had been a medic long enough to know that questions can be walls, and right now this girl needed a door. "Let me take a look," he said. Wren shook her head. Stitch pulled a stool to the center of the garage, sat down on it, and waited. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just sat there with his grease-stained hands resting on his knees and his salt and pepper hair falling across his forehead, and his eyes steady and patient and completely devoid of judgment. 90 seconds passed. Then Wren set the broom against the wall, walked to where Stitch was sitting, and slowly, carefully lifted the hem of her hoodie just far enough to expose her left side. The bruise ran from just below her ribs to her hip, deep purple at the center, fading to green and yellow at the edges, shaped like nothing that could have come from a fall, or a door, or a basketball game. Shaped like a boot. The tread pattern was almost visible in the discoloration, a series of parallel lines pressed into the skin of a 90-pound girl by a 240-pound man. Stitch's hands didn't tremble. His face didn't change. But something behind his eyes shifted the way the sky shifts before a storm that is still too far away to hear, but close enough to feel. He pressed two fingers gently against her lower ribs. Wren hissed through her teeth. "Does it hurt when you breathe?" A nod. "Sharp pain or dull sharp?" "When I breathe deep or twist." Stitch pressed again, higher, lighter. Wren's whole body flinched, but she held still, teeth clenched, fists balled at her sides, enduring the examination with the practiced stoicism of someone who had been hurt so many times that pain had become a dialect she was fluent in. "Two ribs," Stitch said. "Could be cracked. Need an x-ray to be sure, but the tenderness in your breathing pattern are consistent with fractures." He lowered her hoodie gently and looked her in the eye. "Wren, this needs to be documented." The mask came up, fast, a steel door slamming behind her eyes, sealing off whatever had been visible a moment before. She stepped back. "I'll be fine. You're not fine. You've got at least two cracked ribs and a bruise the shape of a boot print on your side. So that's not fine. That's not clumsy. That's not an accident. If I say anything, he'll call the caseworker. Say I'm lying. Say I'm a problem kid. Then it's a group home. I've been in 3 already. They're worse." Her voice was flat, recited. The voice of a child who has rehearsed this calculus so many times that the math does itself. After 4 placements, they stop trying. You just age out. 12 to 18 in whatever hole they put you in, and then you're nobody's problem anymore. Stitch said nothing for a moment. Then he stood, walked to the office at the back of the garage, and returned with Dane's cell phone in his hand. He held it out to Wren, not to Dane, not to Roach, not to any of the men who had been building a case in the background, documenting and photographing and making calls. He held it out to the 12-year-old girl standing in front of him with cracked ribs and a boot-shaped bruise and eyes that had seen more darkness than most people see in a lifetime. Wren looked at the phone, then at Stitch, then at the phone again. "There's a detective," Stitch said. "Her name is Maddox. She works for the county. She's not a caseworker. She's not part of the system that put you in that house. Her job is to find the truth about what's happening to kids like you, and she's already been looking into your situation because we asked her to." Wren's eyes widened. The mask cracked. Not much. A hairline fracture barely visible, but enough for something to get through. "You asked. We've been documenting everything, Wren. Every bruise. Every date. Every lie he made you tell. We've been building a case because we wanted to make sure that when someone finally listened, there would be enough evidence to make it stick." Stitch held the phone steady. "But this call shouldn't come from us. It should come from you, because it's your story, and you're the one who gets to decide when it's told." Wren stared at the phone for a long time. Her hands were shaking. Her cracked ribs ached with every breath. Outside the garage, the late afternoon sun was beginning its descent behind the hills, and the light coming through the high windows turned gold, and then amber, and then the deep orange of endings and beginnings. She took the phone. She dialed the number that Stitch recited from a card in his vest pocket. The phone rang twice. A woman's voice answered, crisp and professional. Wren spoke. Her voice did not shake. It did not crack. It came out clear and level and sharp, like a blade that had been waiting 12 years to be drawn. My name is Ren Morrow. I live at 14 Maple Street in Braxton Falls. I'm 12 years old and I'm being hurt by my foster father, Russell Phelps. I have cracked ribs and bruises and I can describe every one of them. She paused, drew a breath that cost her, then delivered the line that changed the trajectory of the entire investigation. And I think the man who's hurting me did something to my mother 12 years ago. Her name was Nora Morrow. She disappeared and he was the last person who saw her and nobody ever asked him why. The garage was silent. Stitch stood with his arms at his sides and tears running into the creases of his weathered face. In the doorway to the main room, Dane leaned against the frame with his eyes closed and his head bowed, and for the first time in 20 years, his hands were not steady. On the other end of the phone, Lena Maddox listened to every word. Then she said 4 sentences that set the final machinery in motion. Ren, I hear you. I believe you. We are filing an emergency petition today. I need you to be at the Braxton Falls Courthouse on Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Ren handed the phone back to Stitch. She looked at her hands. They had stopped shaking. She picked up the push broom and went back to work. Thursday night, the clubhouse was quiet. Most of the club had gone home, but Roach and Dane remained at the corner booth, a map of Maple Street pulled up on Dane's laptop. Roach's notebook opened between them, a pot of coffee on its third brewing. Dane's phone buzzed. Maddox, hearing is confirmed for Friday 9 a.m. Judge Patricia Calloway. I've submitted the evidence packet. Photographs, medical notes from the school clinic, teacher statements, the residential history showing Phelps's pattern of county transfers, and the file on Nora Morrow's disappearance. The hospital records from Ren's pediatric visit are in there too. The judge will have everything by tonight. Dane exhaled. There's something else, Maddox continued. Her voice changed. Tighter. The voice of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. I dug deeper into the transfer paperwork Phelps filed. The receiving county is Orwell County, 200 miles north. It's a county with a documented history of lax foster oversight. 3 CPS workers for 800 cases. Phelps has used Orwell County before. 7 years ago, he transferred another foster child there. A boy, 9 years old. The boy was removed from Phelps's care in Orwell County 18 months later due to severe malnutrition and untreated fractures. By then, Phelps had already moved to a new county and started over with a different child. Silence. This man has been operating inside the system for over a decade, Maddox said, using its own weaknesses against it, moving before anyone can build a case, collecting children and checks and leaving damage in every county he passes through. And Nora, the investigation into her disappearance is being reopened as of this afternoon. I've flagged Phelps as a person of interest. Braxton Falls PD is coordinating with the State Bureau. If there's something to find, they'll find it. Dane hung up. He looked at Roach across the table. In the dim light of the clubhouse, the big man's face looked 10 years older than it had 3 weeks ago. Friday, Dane said. Roach nodded. He closed his notebook and tucked it into his vest. Then he stood, put on his jacket, and walked to the door. I'm picking her up at 7, he said. I'll be at the house. Crank will be at the curb. Dane nodded. Roach paused at the door. He didn't turn around. His voice was low, rough, scraped raw by something that had nothing to do with his throat. She made that call herself, Dane. A 12-year-old girl with cracked ribs picked up a phone and reported the man who's been hurting her since she was a baby. She didn't ask us to do it. She didn't wait for someone to save her. She saved herself. His massive shoulders rose and fell with a breath that sounded like it carried the weight of every child he'd ever failed to protect. We just gave her the phone. The door closed behind him. The clubhouse settled into silence. Dane sat alone in the corner, booth laptop, closed coffee cold, listening to the building breathe around him. The jukebox was dark. The bar was empty. The pool table stood under its single overhead light, like a stage waiting for a play that had already been performed. Tomorrow would bring the courtroom. Tomorrow would bring the judge, and the evidence and the terrible machinery of a legal system that had failed Ren Morrow for 12 years and was about to get one chance to make it right. But tonight in the quiet, Dane allowed himself to think about a young woman named Nora Morrow, who had worked 300 yards from where he was sitting, who had carried her baby daughter to the same stretch of Route 9 every day, who had written "My Heart" on the back of a photograph and then disappeared so completely that the only trace she left behind was a birth certificate in a child's pocket and 2 words in pencil. Find her. Dane reached into his vest and pulled out the folded paper. Ren's birth certificate. He'd been carrying it for 3 weeks now, next to his chest, the way he had once carried photographs of his unit in Iraq. Talismans against the dark. He unfolded it and read the 2 words on the back one more time. Then he folded it again and put it back, close to his heart, where the things that matter live. Friday was 12 hours away, and after Friday, nothing in Braxton Falls would ever be the same. Friday dawned cold and clear over Braxton Falls. The sky was the kind of blue that only happens in late October, scrubbed clean by overnight winds so sharp and bright it looked like something painted by a hand that had run out of patience for clouds. Frost clung to the windshields of cars parked along Main Street and glittered on the chain-link fences and turned the dead grass in front yards into fields of tiny silver needles that caught the early light and threw it back. At 7 o'clock sharp, Roach pulled his Harley to the curb in front of the blue house on Maple Street. The engine idled low, a deep rolling pulse that vibrated through the morning stillness and rattled the loose panes in the front windows of neighboring houses. Roach sat with his boots on the pavement and his white beard tucked into the collar of his jacket and his breath coming out in slow clouds that dissolved against the cold air. He didn't honk. He didn't call out. He just waited. At the curb behind him, Crank sat on his own bike engine off, arms crossed over his massive chest, red beard catching the frostlight. He looked like a statue carved from something that didn't believe in compromise. The front door of the blue house opened. Russell Phelps stood in the doorway in a stained undershirt and sweatpants, a coffee mug in one hand and a face full of the particular malice that alcohol leaves behind when it retreats. His bloodshot eyes found Roach on the Harley, then Crank at the curb, and his jaw tightened. "The hell do you want?" Roach didn't raise his voice. He spoke at conversational volume, which at 7 in the morning on a quiet street carried perfectly well. "I'm here for Ren. She's got an appointment." "What kind of appointment?" "The kind that's none of your business." Russell's hand tightened on the coffee mug. His eyes moved from Roach to Crank and back. The math was the same as it had been in the garage. 2 large men on motorcycles plus the clear implication that more were available, versus one hungover man in his doorway with nothing but anger and a ceramic mug. He stepped aside. Ren appeared behind him. Same hoodie, same patched jeans. Her backpack on one shoulder, the blue one Jolene had packed, holding everything she considered worth carrying. Her face was pale. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a greenish yellow, the ghost of a hand that had swung hard enough to leave its memory in her skin for weeks. She didn't look at Russell as she passed him. She walked through the doorway and down the porch steps and across the cracked concrete path with the steady, measured stride of someone leaving a building that is on fire and has been told not to run. Russell watched her go. His mouth opened as if to say something, then closed, then opened again. "You'd better have her back by noon." Nobody answered him. Ren climbed onto the back of Roach's Harley. She was light enough that the bike barely shifted under her weight. Her thin arms wrapped around Roach's midsection, careful to avoid pressure on her own left side, where the cracked ribs still ached, and she pressed her face against the worn leather of his vest and closed her eyes. Roach kicked the bike into gear. They pulled away from Maple Street. Crank followed. The 2 Harleys rumbled down the empty road side by side, their exhaust notes braiding together in the cold air, and behind them the blue house grew smaller and smaller until it was just a smudge of peeling paint at the end of a block that nobody on it had ever cared enough to fix. 3 blocks from the courthouse, Ren spoke. Her voice was muffled against Roach's back, barely audible over the engine, but he heard every word the way a father hears a child's voice in a crowded room. "Where are we going, courthouse? Someone needs to ask you whether you want to keep living in that house." Silence. 2 more blocks. The courthouse tower appeared above the roofline of Main Street, its white clock face bright against the October sky. "Do I have a choice?" Roach felt the words hit him in the center of his chest like a fist wrapped in something softer than leather and harder than bone. "Yeah, Ren, for the first time you do." The Braxton Falls County Courthouse was a 100-year-old building made of limestone and oak, and the accumulated gravity of 10,000 decisions that had changed people's lives. Tall windows lined the second-floor courtroom, and on this Friday morning, sunlight poured through them in long white columns that fell across polished wooden benches and warmed the scuffed hardwood floor and made the dust motes spinning in the air look like tiny gold coins falling from a height that nobody could see. Wren sat at the front table. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles white. She stared straight ahead at the empty judge's bench with an expression that was not fear and was not courage, but was something in between that doesn't have a name. The expression of someone standing at the edge of a cliff that they have been walking toward their entire life. Behind her in the first row of the gallery, Roach filled the bench. His white beard was neatly trimmed, and he wore the dark blue Oxford he'd bought for his wife's funeral 17 years ago, pressed and clean under his leather vest. His massive hands rested on his knees, palms down, perfectly still. Dane stood beside him, arms crossed, scar visible in the hard light from the windows. His face showed nothing, which was itself a kind of statement, the blankness of a man who has decided that whatever happens next, he will be ready for it. Stitch sat in the second row. Crank beside him, his red beard groomed and his enormous frame squeezed into a sport coat that had clearly not been designed with him in mind. Jolene was there in a gray dress and a string of pearls she saved for occasions that mattered. And beside them and behind them, filling the back rows of the gallery in a long, quiet line, sat half a dozen more stone devils. Leather vests over clean shirts, boots polished or at least wiped down, tattoos and scars and weathered faces, and hands that had built and broken and fixed things for decades. They didn't speak, they didn't shift or whisper or check their phones. They sat with the particular stillness of men who understand that presence is its own language, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say in a courtroom is nothing at all. Across the aisle, Russell Phelps sat with his court-appointed lawyer, a young man in a cheap suit who kept adjusting his tie and glancing at the gallery with an expression that suggested he was rethinking his career choices. Russell's face was flushed. His tie was crooked. He hadn't shaved. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the room, the exits, the judge's bench, the bikers. Everything except the girl at the front table. He hadn't looked at Wren once. The bailiff called the room to order. A door behind the bench opened, and Judge Patricia Calloway entered the courtroom. She was in her mid-60s, silver hair cut short and practical, wire-rimmed glasses, a face that had been shaped by years of listening to stories that most people couldn't bear to hear and making decisions that most people couldn't bear to make. She had presided over custody hearings in abuse cases and termination of parental rights for more than 20 years. And in that time, she had developed the ability to read a courtroom the way a sailor reads the sky, finding the truth in the spaces between what people said. She sat, she looked at the gallery. Her eyes lingered for a moment on the rows of leather and tattoos, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, an adjustment of expectations that was visible only if you were watching for it. Then she opened the file on her bench and began to read. Detective Lena Maddox was called first. She approached the front of the courtroom in a dark blazer and flat shoes, her brown hair pulled back, her face composed in the professional neutrality of someone who has learned that emotion in a courtroom is a liability. She carried a folder thick enough to cast a shadow. She presented the evidence the way a mason lays bricks, one piece at a time, solid, level, each piece supporting the one that came before it. Photographs of bruises in various stages of healing, dated and annotated, taken over a period of 3 weeks. A split lip, fingerprint-shaped contusions on a wrist, a boot-shaped bruise across the lower rib cage. School medical records from Braxton Falls Middle School, documenting 8 separate visits to the clinic in 14 months, each one attributed to an accident, each one treated and filed and forgotten. Teacher statements, 4 of them describing a student who was withdrawn frequently, hungry, sometimes unable to participate in physical education due to unexplained soreness, a student who flinched when adults raised their voices and who always wore long sleeves regardless of the weather. Maddox laid each document on the table in front of the judge, like a card in a game that only had one possible outcome. Then she opened the second folder. Your Honor, 12 years ago, a 21-year-old single mother named Nora Morrow disappeared from this town without a trace. She was employed as a waitress at a diner on Route 9, where she worked double shifts to support her infant daughter, Wren. She was described by her employer as devoted, reliable, and deeply bonded with her child. She never missed a shift in 9 months. Maddox paused. The courtroom was silent enough to hear the clock on the wall. On the morning of June 14th, Nora Morrow took her 4-month-old daughter to a routine pediatric appointment at Braxton Falls Community Clinic. The doctor's notes described the baby as healthy and the mother as attentive and engaged. That afternoon, according to Mr. Phelps, Nora abandoned her daughter at a gas station on Route 9 and was never seen again. Maddox looked at Russell Phelps for the first time. He didn't meet her eyes. Mr. Phelps presented himself to the county as a family friend. He filed for emergency foster placement. He was granted temporary custody within 48 hours. No thorough investigation was conducted. No family members were contacted because none were listed in the file. And for 12 years, Mr. Phelps has moved Wren from county to county, 4 transfers in 12 years, each time relocating just before local child welfare agencies began routine oversight reviews. She placed the final document on the table. Residential records show that Russell Phelps did not live in Braxton Falls when Nora Morrow was alive. He moved here in the same month she disappeared. There is no record of any prior connection between them. He was not a family friend. He was a stranger who appeared with an infant, told a story that nobody checked, and has been collecting state foster payments for 12 years while systematically abusing the child in his care. The courtroom breathed. In the gallery, Roach's hands had curled into fists so tight that the wood of the bench creaked. Dane's jaw was set like something cast in iron. Jolene pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and held it there. Maddox straightened. We are recommending an immediate criminal investigation into the disappearance of Nora Morrow with Russell Phelps named as a person of interest. We are also requesting emergency removal of Wren Morrow from Mr. Phelps's custody effective today. Russell's lawyer objected. His voice cracked on the first word, and by the time he finished his sentence about due process and unsubstantiated allegations, the judge had already raised her hand for silence, with the unhurried authority of someone who has heard every objection the law allows and has learned to distinguish the ones that matter from the ones that don't. The objection was noted and overruled in the same breath. Then the judge called Russell Phelps to the stand. What happened next was something that every person in that courtroom would remember for the rest of their lives. Not because it was dramatic, not because there was shouting or theatrics or the kind of courtroom explosion that happens in movies, but because it was the slow, methodical unraveling of a man who had spent 12 years building a lie and had never once imagined he would be asked to defend it under oath. The judge asked simple questions. When did you move to Braxton Falls? How did you know Nora Morrow? When did she leave the child with you? Where exactly on Route 9 was the gas station? Russell answered the first 2 questions with the rehearsed smoothness of someone who has told the same story so many times it has calcified into something that feels like truth. But by the 3rd question, cracks began to appear. Small ones. A date that didn't match the documents. A detail about the gas station that contradicted the police report. A hesitation before the word friend that lasted half a second too long. By the 4th question, the cracks had become fissures. Russell's voice rose. His face darkened from flush to crimson. His hands gripped the arms of the witness chair so hard the wood groaned. He began to contradict himself, doubling back on answers he'd given 30 seconds earlier. And when the judge pointed out the inconsistency, he didn't correct himself. He attacked. He called the bikers criminals. He called Maddox a liar. He said the system was rigged against working men who took in kids nobody wanted. His voice filled the courtroom like smoke filling a closed room, thick and acrid and suffocating. And with every word he spoke, the mask he'd worn for 12 years slipped further, revealing the face underneath. The face of a man who had never seen Wren Morrow as a child, who had never seen her as a person, who had seen her as a paycheck and a possession and a problem that could be solved with a closed fist and the certain knowledge that nobody was watching. The judge let him talk. She sat with her hands folded and her glasses reflecting the courtroom lights and her expression perfectly, terribly neutral. And she let Russell Phelps talk until the talking became its own evidence. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Phelps. You may step down." Russell returned to his seat. His lawyer whispered something urgent. Russell shoved the lawyer's hand away. The judge turned to Wren. The courtroom went still. Not quiet, still. The difference is important. Quiet is the absence of sound. Still is the absence of everything except attention. Every person in that room stopped breathing at the same moment, and in that collective pause, the only thing that moved was the sunlight shifting across the floor as a cloud passed over the courthouse and moved on. Ren Morrow. The judge's voice was gentle, not soft because soft can sound condescending to a child who has been patronized by every adult in her life. Gentle. The gentleness of someone who understands that the next few minutes will determine the course of a life and that the person living that life is 12 years old and has cracked ribs that still hurt when she breathes. You've heard everything today. You've heard what the detective said. You've heard what Mr. Phelps said. This is your chance to speak. Do you understand what's happening? Yes, ma'am. 2 words. Clear. Steady. The voice of a girl who had spent her whole life being spoken about and was now for the first time being spoken to. Do you feel safe in Mr. Phelps' home? Wren shook her head. A single small movement. Left to right. No. Can you tell me why Wren's hands were trembling in her lap? But her voice when it came did not tremble. It came out the way water comes out of a cracked dam. Not all at once. Not in a rush. In a steady, relentless flow that carried 12 years of silence with it and deposited that silence on the courtroom floor like sediment from a river that had been running underground for too long. He hits me when he's mad, or when he's drunk, or just because. He says I'm worthless, that nobody wants me, that if I tell anyone, they'll put me somewhere worse. I've had bruises since I was little. I've been in 3 group homes before this one, and they were bad. But this is worse. I just try to stay quiet and do what he says so it's not as bad. A single tear escaped her right eye. It traveled down her cheek, following the faded path of the bruise that Russell Phelps had put there, and dropped onto her folded hands. Behind her, Roach's fist clenched so hard the bench groaned. Dane closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. His jaw was a line drawn in granite. When he opened his eyes, they were wet, but his face was still. The judge waited. She could see that Wren had more to say, and she gave her the space to say it because some testimony needs silence the way a seed needs soil. Wren looked up. Her eyes were bright, but her voice was iron. I found my own birth certificate in a box in his closet when I was 10. My mother's name was on it. Nora Morrow. I'd never heard her name before. He told me I was dropped off by someone who didn't want me. But I found her name, and I started looking. She took a breath that cost her. Her cracked ribs protested. She ignored them. I found out she used to work at a diner near the Stone Devils Clubhouse on Route 9. That's why I went there. That's why I asked for work. I didn't just need a job. I needed to be close to the last place she was seen. I needed someone to help me find her. And they did. They saw me. They're the only ones who ever saw me. The judge's expression didn't change. But her eyes behind those wire-rimmed glasses were doing something that only Wren could see from her angle at the front table. They were filling. Wren, if you could choose where to live right now, where would you want to go? Wren turned in her chair. She looked at the gallery. Her eyes found Roach first, the giant with the white beard who had walked her home in the dark and handed her a card with a phone number and told her that courage deserves backup. Then Dane standing like a pillar scar, catching the light, arms at his sides, now fists unclenched open. Then Stitch, who had put a broom in her hands and taught her that an engine breathes. Then Crank, who had built walls of muscle between her and the man who hurt her. Then Jolene, who had fed her without asking and held her without being told. The whole row of stone devils. Black leather and silver patches and scarred hands and weathered faces. Men who had seen a bruised girl walk through their door asking for work, and had understood with the immediate and uncomplicated clarity of people who have been broken and rebuilt themselves that she wasn't asking for work. She was asking to be seen. With them. Her voice was clear enough to reach the back of the courtroom. The Stone Devils. They gave me a job when I asked. They taught me things. They saw me. They're the only ones who ever let me choose. The judge followed Wren's gaze across the gallery. She took in the leather vests, the tattoos, the scars. She had presided over cases involving motorcycle clubs before, usually on the wrong side of the law, and she knew what the world assumed about men who looked like this. She also knew, after 20 years on the bench, that the world's assumptions were wrong often enough to be dangerous. She looked at Roach. Mr. DeLuca, please step forward. Roach stood. His boots were heavy on the hardwood floor. Each step sounded like a heartbeat. He approached the bench and stood with his hands at his sides, his white beard bright against the dark leather of his vest, and he looked up at the judge with the open, undefended expression of a man who has nothing to hide because hiding is a luxury he gave up a long time ago. "You heard the child's wish," the judge said. "Are you and your associates prepared to take temporary guardianship of Ren Morrow, pending full background checks, home study, and foster certification classes?" Roach didn't hesitate. There was no pause, no calculation, no moment of weighing costs and benefits. He answered the way a man answers when the answer has been living inside him for years, waiting for the question. "Yes, Your Honor, whatever it takes. We'll keep her safe." The judge studied him for a long moment. The courtroom clock ticked. Sunlight moved across the floor. Somewhere outside, a car horn sounded on Main Street, faint and irrelevant. A noise from a world that had no idea what was happening inside these limestone walls. "Emergency temporary guardianship is granted to Hank DeLuca. Mr. Phelps, you are to have no contact with the child. Bailiffs will escort you for processing. Detectives are waiting outside regarding the matter of Nora Morrow." Russell erupted. He lurched to his feet, knocking his chair backward, his face the color of a wound, and the words that came out of him were not words so much as sounds. The raw, incoherent noise of a man whose 12-year structure of lies was collapsing around him in real time. He cursed the judge. He cursed the bikers. He cursed the system that he had manipulated for a decade and that had finally, after all these years, turned its machinery on him. The bailiffs moved in. They were efficient and unhurried the way professionals are when they've done something 100 times, and Russell Phelps was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, still shouting, still red-faced, still refusing to look at the girl whose life he had tried to reduce to a monthly check and a closed fist. Ren didn't watch him go. She sat at the front table with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point of sunlight on the hardwood floor, and she didn't move until the door closed behind him and the shouting faded to silence. The gavel fell, a single sharp sound, like a period at the end of a sentence that had taken 12 years to write. It was over. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Ren stood frozen. The marble floor reflected the overhead lights. People moved around her, lawyers and clerks and court officers flowing past like water around a stone. She stood in the center of it all with her backpack on one shoulder and her hands at her sides and her face showing an expression that was not relief and was not joy, but was something more fundamental than either. The expression of a person who has been holding their breath for so long that they've forgotten what breathing feels like and is now trying to remember. Jolene reached her first. She wrapped her arms around the girl in a hug that was gentle and firm, at the same time the kind of hug that says, "I'm here, and you're safe, and you don't have to be strong right now," without using any words at all. Ren's body stiffened for a moment, the automatic resistance of someone unaccustomed to being touched without pain, and then something gave way. Her shoulders dropped. Her forehead fell against Jolene's collarbone, and she stood there breathing, just breathing, while Jolene held her. Stitch came next. He ruffled her hair with his grease-stained hand, a quick, rough gesture that carried more tenderness than 100 gentle touches. "Good work today, kid." Crank lifted her off the ground, straight up one-handed, as if she weighed nothing, which to him she nearly did. He held her at eye level and grinned through his red beard, and Ren laughed. The sound startled everyone who heard it, including Ren herself. It was a real laugh, full and sudden and surprised, as if it had been locked in a room inside her for years and had just found an open window. Crank set her down carefully, the way a man sets down something that he has just realized is infinitely more valuable than he initially understood. Then Roach crouched in front of her, down on one knee, his massive frame folded to bring his face level with hers, his white beard close enough for her to touch. "You okay, kid?" Ren looked at him. "I'm free." "Yeah," Roach said. His voice was thick, rough. The voice of a man speaking through something too large to swallow. "You're free, and you're coming home with me." They cleared out the old storage room off the back hallway of the clubhouse, a room that had spent years accumulating the things that men accumulate when they have space and no reason to organize it. Broken furniture, boxes of old rally shirts, a set of mismatched tires, 3 cases of motor oil bought on sale 4 years ago and never opened. All of it went, every piece, carried out by hands that had dismantled engines and rebuilt transmissions and now applied the same methodical precision to the task of turning dead space into living space. Dane and Stitch painted the walls. Light blue, the color of a sky that has decided to be kind. Crank built a loft bed from reclaimed lumber sanded and sealed and joined with the same care he brought to building motorcycle frames sturdy enough to hold three of him. Beneath it, he set a solid oak desk with drawers and a lamp bought secondhand from a furniture store where Dane had negotiated until the owner, recognizing something in his voice that went beyond commerce, sold it for half price. Jolene brought new sheets with a subtle motorcycle pattern in navy and gray. Pillows, a warm comforter that matched the walls. On the wall beside the desk, Stitch hung a pegboard with hooks already placed, and across the top, hand-stenciled in black paint, 5 letters, Wren's Stuff. And on the inside of the door, Dane installed a deadbolt. Simple, solid, operated only from the inside, a lock that could not be opened from the hallway. A lock that said, "This room belongs to you and nobody enters without your permission." By Sunday evening, the room was finished. Wren stood in the doorway with her backpack in her hand. Everything she owned in the world. She stared at the blue walls and the clean bed and the desk with its lamp and the pegboard with her name and the lock on the inside of the door. And she stared for a long time without speaking, because some things are too large for the words available to a 12-year-old girl who has never had a room of her own. The entire club had gathered in the main room behind her. Dane raised a bottle of root beer. To Ren Morrow, the kid who walked through our door asking for work instead of a handout. More courage than most grown men I've known in my whole life. You've got a family now, messy, loud, rough around the edges. But we've got your back, always. To family. To family, the room echoed. A dozen voices, low and rough and full of something none of them could name, but all of them recognized. Ren tried to speak. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. But the words couldn't make it past the thing that had risen in her chest, a pressure that was the opposite of pain, the feeling of a space filling up with something warm and heavy and unfamiliar after being empty for so long, she'd forgotten it was there. She nodded. Tears fell. She let them come. Later that night, Roach found her on the front steps of the clubhouse. The sky was enormous and black and filled with more stars than the town's light pollution usually allowed, as if the sky had decided to make an exception for tonight. The air was cold and clean and smelled like paint and frost and the faint warmth of motorcycle exhaust from the bikes along the curb. Roach lowered himself onto the step beside her. The concrete groaned. He stretched his legs out and leaned back, and for a while neither of them spoke, because some silences are more eloquent than anything language can produce. You good Ren thought about it. Really thought. Turned it over. Held it up to the light. Yeah, she said quietly. For the first time. Yeah, she leaned her head against Roach's shoulder. A small gesture. A tilt that weighed almost nothing. But Roach felt it like an anchor dropping through deep water and finding ground. Will we find out what happened to my mom? Roach put his arm around her. Carefully. The way you hold something that has been broken and is still healing. We're already looking, kid. Detectives are on it now because of what we uncovered. Whatever the truth is, you won't face it alone. Ren nodded against his shoulder. Thank you for seeing me that day. Roach's throat closed. When he spoke, his voice was cracked and raw, and he didn't try to fix it. Thank you for being brave enough to walk through that door. They sat together on the steps, the old man and the girl Waman watching the stars turn overhead. Inside the jukebox played something slow and steady, a song with a bass line that thumped like a resting heartbeat. Earlier that evening, while Ren was exploring her new room, Dane's phone had buzzed one final time. Maddox. Her voice was different, tight, controlled in the way people are controlled when they're holding something volatile. We searched the house on Maple Street, basement level. Behind a false panel in the utility room, there's a locked space. Steel door, padlock from the outside. What was inside? A wooden box. Personal effects. A leather journal filled with entries in a young woman's handwriting. Photographs of a baby girl at various ages, each one labeled on the back. A sealed envelope addressed to Ren Morrow, never mailed, containing a letter. Maddox paused. The letter begins with the words, "If you're reading this, I need you to know that I never left you." Dane closed his eyes. There's more. The journal entries start hopeful and become increasingly afraid. The final entries describe someone following her, watching her apartment, showing up at the diner. And beneath the letter, folded into a square, a hand-drawn map. A gas station on Route 9, a road heading north, and a circle around a town 200 miles away with 3 words written beside it. What 3 words? He's taking me here. Silence on both ends. Nora Morrow is not confirmed deceased, Maddox said. There are no remains, no evidence of death on the property. This is now a federal investigation. Kidnapping. Interstate. The FBI is being brought in Monday morning. Dane exhaled slowly. She could still be alive. We don't know that, but we don't know she isn't. And for the first time in 12 years, someone is looking. Dane hung up. He stood alone in the office for a long time, one hand resting on the desk, the other pressed against the folded birth certificate in his vest pocket. Then he walked out to the front steps where Roach and Wren sat beneath the stars, and he didn't say a word about the phone call because tonight was not the night for that. Tonight was the night for sitting and breathing and watching the sky and feeling for the first time that the ground beneath their feet was solid. The search for Nora Morrow would begin in earnest on Monday. The evidence would be cataloged. The map would be followed. The 3 words in a frightened woman's handwriting would lead investigators north along a road that nobody had thought to travel for 12 years. But that was Monday's work. Tonight belonged to the girl on the steps and the man beside her and the stars above them, and the quiet, stubborn, unbreakable thing that had started 6 weeks ago when a bruised 12-year-old pushed open a steel door and said 5 words to a room full of strangers. I'm looking for work. She had found something better. On the corkboard in the main room next to ride schedules and oil change reminders, Wren's first homework assignment was pinned with a thumbtack. Every answer correct. On the refrigerator in the kitchen, taped with masking tape, a pencil sketch of a motorcycle engine drawn from memory, every cylinder and valve rendered with careful precision. In the bottom corner, a signature, Wren M. In the garage on the second shelf of the main tool bench, a red steel toolbox sat in its place. On the front, stenciled in white paint, her name. And in the small blue room at the end of the hallway behind a door with a deadbolt that locked only from the inside, a framed Polaroid hung on the wall beside the bed. A young woman holding an infant. A smile too private and too true to belong to anyone except a mother who had called her daughter her heart. Below the photograph on the desk, the folded birth certificate lay open. The 2 words on the back, the ones written in pencil by a 10-year-old girl who had found her mother's name in a closet and decided she would not stop looking, those 2 words had been crossed out. Not erased. Crossed out. Because Wren Morrow was not the kind of person who erased things. She was the kind of person who faced them. And in their place, in the same careful pencil pressed hard, because the words mattered, she had written 2 new lines. Found family, still looking.